She was supposed to be the easiest person to silence. Quiet floor nurse. No family connections, no powerful allies, no one to fight for her. The hospital executives had done this before, buried inconvenient employees under paperwork and threats until they simply disappeared. But at 3:47 in the morning, inside a trauma bay that smelled of antiseptic and desperation, Nurse Nora Callahan looked down at a dying man and made a decision that would unravel everything. Because the woman they had chosen to destroy was not who any of them believed her to be. And by the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. This is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next is something you will not see coming. If you've been watching for a while, you already know we don't do ordinary here. Smash that like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The night shift at Hargrove General Hospital in Salt Lake City had a particular kind of silence to it. Not peaceful, not restful, but the silence of people trying very hard not to make mistakes. It was 11:20 p.m. when Nora Callahan clocked in, sliding her badge through the reader near the nurse's station on the 4th floor, with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done it 1,010 times. She had 3 years on the overnight rotation, and the motion was as automatic as breathing. She hung her jacket on the hook behind the door, pulled her dark hair back with a plain elastic band, and picked up the patient chart clipboard without anyone saying a word to her. That was normal. Most of the staff didn't say much to Nora. She was quiet, she was thorough, and she didn't push herself into conversations she hadn't been invited into. The other nurses had learned early on that she wasn't cold. She'd step in immediately when something needed doing, but she wasn't the type to linger at the station trading gossip between rounds. She did her job. She went home. She came back. Nobody thought much about her beyond that. 4th floor that night was running full. Post-surgical recovery in rooms 401 through 407, 2 patients in isolation at the far end of the East Wing, a teenager with a spinal compression injury, fresh from the ICU step-down program, and 3 other beds in various states of overnight management. There was one empty bed near the East Corridor that the charge nurse, a heavy-set man named Dennis Farrow, had flagged in the handoff briefing with a single, blunt sentence, reserved for a late admission. VIP. Don't ask questions and don't discuss it with anyone. Nora hadn't asked. She'd written the room number in her notepad and moved on. She spent her first 40 minutes working through the standard overnight checks, vital signs, fluid levels, pain assessments, a tedious but necessary confirmation that every patient who had been stable at shift change was still stable now. The teenager in 409, a 16-year-old named Marcus, who had been brought in after a diving accident at a public pool, was restless despite his sedation and kept trying to shift position in ways his injury made dangerous. Nora spent 10 extra minutes with him, adjusting his support pillow, speaking to him in a low voice until he settled. He probably couldn't hear her clearly. She spoke to him anyway. She was finishing the repositioning when the elevator at the end of the hall opened with a sound that didn't match the normal pace of the floor. 3 men in dark suits moved a gurney out of the elevator, with the practiced urgency of people who had rehearsed this, but were now doing it faster than the rehearsal had accounted for. Behind them came Dr. Raymond Stoll, chief of surgery at Hargrove General, not in scrubs, not in the casual clothing of a physician called from home in the middle of the night, but in a charcoal dinner jacket with a tie that had been loosened 1 button at the collar. He had come from an event. He had come fast. Stoll was 53. Silver at the temples, square-shouldered, the kind of man who moved through hospital corridors with the specific bodily authority of someone who had never once had to wait for a room to clear before he entered it. He was technically excellent. Nora had seen his surgical outcomes in the shared reports that circulated among nursing staff and they were genuinely impressive. He was also the type of surgeon who had, in 3 years of working in the same building, spoken to Nora directly exactly 4 times. Twice to correct her documentation. Once to ask where the attending physician for a specific patient was. Once to tell her she was blocking the medication cart. She stepped back to let the gurney pass. The man on it was older, mid to late 60s, she estimated. Broad jaw, deep-set eyes, the kind of face that held the structural memory of authority, even when the person wearing it was clearly in serious distress. His skin had gone the color of old wax. His oxygen saturation monitor had been clipped to his finger during transport. She could see the small red light pulsing, but whoever had done it hurriedly. The reading was 91%. His breathing was shallow and irregular, the chest rising and falling in a pattern that didn't have enough depth to it. One of the suited men kept a hand on the patient's shoulder. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was the gesture of someone who needed to feel they were still doing something useful. East Corridor, Stoll said to Dennis Farrow without looking at him. Get the room prepped. I want the floor cleared of non-essential personnel. Dennis looked down the hall. His gaze crossed Nora's briefly. That means you, Callahan. Take 412 and 413 for the rest of the shift. Stay in the West Wing. What's his presenting condition? Nora asked. Not challenging. Just the question a nurse asks before being removed from proximity to a patient who looks like that. Neither man answered her. She went to 412. She didn't stop paying attention. Patient in 412 was a 71-year-old woman recovering from hip replacement surgery, stable and sleeping lightly. Nora checked her chart, adjusted the blanket that had shifted, confirmed the drain tube was correctly positioned, and stood at the window for approximately 90 seconds looking out at the parking structure across the street, while the part of her brain she kept deliberately quiet did its work without being invited to. The man on the gurney, the pressure behind his color, or rather the absence of it, the quality of his breathing, the way one of the suited men pressing his hand against the right lower portion of the patient's abdomen as they moved, not a standard stabilization hold, more like unconscious pressure applied to where the man had apparently been indicating pain. She went back to the nurse's station. At 11:52 p.m., she heard a change in the voices coming from the East Corridor. Couldn't make out words. She didn't need to. The shift from controlled to strained was audible even through a closed door and 20 meters of hallway to anyone who had spent enough time listening to rooms where things were going wrong. She walked toward it. Dennis Farrow was standing outside the room with his arms crossed, jaw set in the particular way of a man who has been told to hold a position he isn't certain he should be holding. Go back to your wing, Callahan. What's his blood pressure? He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite confidence. 82/50. Dr. Stoll has a protocol running. 82/50. A man who had arrived already pale, already shallow, already visibly losing ground. That number was not the plateau of a stable situation. That number was a direction. Is he reporting pain in his back? She asked. Or abdomen? Any radiation to the Stoll has it handled. Dennis shifted his weight half a step toward her. Not aggressive, just physical emphasis. Go back. She went back. She stood in the West Corridor. She counted to 40. She pulled the small notepad from her breast pocket, the same kind she'd carried since her second week on this floor. Government surplus spiral bound, 3 inches by 5, and wrote 3 words on the top line of a fresh page. She looked at what she'd written. She put the notepad back. She returned to the East Corridor. The room was organized crisis. 2 nurses she recognized Glenda Marsh, who had been at Hargrove 11 years and ran the overnight East Wing with the efficiency of someone who had stopped needing to be told twice about anything, and a newer nurse named Patrick, whose last name Nora hadn't learned yet, were at the medication cart and the fluid line, respectively. A resident she didn't recognize, young enough that he still held the crash cart checklist with both hands as he read it, was positioned near the window. The suited men had been pressed to the far wall. Doctor. Stoll stood at the head of the bed. He was ordering a vasopressor, a medication, to raise systemic blood pressure. His voice was controlled. His hands were steady. He believed he was managing the situation. Nora came to the doorway and stood there. Callahan. Stoll didn't look up. This room is restricted. What's the working diagnosis? He looked up then. The particular weight of his attention settled on her, like something physical. Cardiogenic shock. We are stabilizing. You need to leave this room. Has anyone palpated his abdomen? Glenda glanced involuntarily at the patient's midsection. Just a flicker, then back to her work. Stoll's expression did not shift. I have a diagnosis and a protocol. You are a floor nurse, not a physician, and you are not assigned to this room or this patient. His presentation pattern isn't cardiogenic, Nora said. Her voice was level. No heat in it, no edge, just the flat delivery of something she believed with complete certainty. Pressure loss, the respiratory pattern, the way he's guarding, it's not originating from cardiac failure. He needs abdominal imaging, emergency imaging right now. If this is a ruptured aortic aneurysm, the vasopressor you just ordered is going to raise systemic pressure against a compromised vessel wall, and it will accelerate the hemorrhage. The word hemorrhage dropped into the room and stayed there. Stoll set down the medication chart he was holding. He did it slowly, deliberately, in the manner of a man demonstrating that he was choosing his response rather than reacting to it. I have been practicing medicine, he said, for 27 years. I have performed over 2,000 procedures in this hospital. I am the chief of surgery. You are a floor nurse who has been in this building for 3 years and who does not hold a medical degree, a surgical license, or the authority to contradict a diagnosis in a restricted room at midnight. He pointed at the door. Get out of this room. If you come back through that door again tonight, I will have you written up for insubordination and patient interference before the sun comes up. The room was silent, except for the steady tone of the monitors. Nora looked past Stoll at the man on the bed. His abdomen was distended. Not dramatically, not the kind of distension that announces itself on a chart, but enough. She had seen enough presentations in enough conditions to know what enough looked like. With respect, she said quietly, you are wrong about the diagnosis. And when the imaging confirms it, the delay will have cost him time he doesn't have. She left. She stood in the east corridor and breathed through her nose, slowly, the way she had taught herself to breathe in circumstances where breathing slowly was not the natural impulse. Her pulse was elevated. She acknowledged it and let it continue without chasing it down. She walked to the nurse's station, sat down at the terminal, and pulled up the patient intake file. It had been entered hurriedly on admission. 3 lines of notes, no imaging orders, vital signs logged, but barely annotated. The name at the top of the file, William P. Branford. She stared at it for a moment. Then, against protocol, she opened a browser window. Typed the name. The search results loaded in under 5 seconds. Senator William P. Branford, U.S. Senate, incumbent 3 terms. Current ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. His official photograph looked back at her, the same jaw, the same eyes, 15 years younger, and considerably more color in his face than the man on the gurney, but without question, the same person. Closed the browser. She picked up the floor phone and called the hospital's after-hours administrative line. It rang 6 times before a woman answered, groggy and clipped. Nora identified herself by name and employee number and said, I need to escalate a patient safety concern to whoever is above doctor. Stoll on the on-call chain tonight. A pause. Stoll is the senior physician on call. I understand that. I need his supervisor. That would be the hospital director. But escalation past the on-call physician requires the on-call physician to agree to the escalation. That is not consistent with patient safety protocol. It is consistent with how we handle it after midnight. At this facility, the woman said, and the line went dead. Nora set the phone down. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk, looking at the blank screen of the closed browser window. Then she picked up her notepad and turned to the page where she'd written 3 words. Aortic, aneurysm, rupturing. She turned to a clean page and began writing a timeline. She wrote the time she had first seen the patient on the gurney, the observable indicators, the blood pressure reading Dennis had given her, the medication she had heard stole order, the time she had raised her concern, the time she had been dismissed. She wrote it all in the compact, sequential shorthand she had developed over many years, and in many different kinds of rooms. She was halfway through the second page when the alarm came. 12:14 a.m. The sustained tone of a cardiac monitor hitting 0 has a particular quality that separates it from every other sound a hospital makes at night. It doesn't build. It doesn't waver. It arrives flat and absolute, and something in the human nervous system responds to it before the conscious mind has fully processed what it's hearing. Nora was moving before she had decided to move. The room was controlled panic, the specific kind that looks like competence from the outside, but is running on adrenaline and framework rather than clear thinking. Stoll was calling compressions. The resident was at the defibrillator. Glenda was at the crash cart. Patrick was on the phone, paging someone. The suited men had been pushed to the far corner. Nora came through the door and went directly to the bedside, pressed her hand flat against the senator's abdomen. Rigid. The board-like rigidity of a peritoneum under catastrophic pressure, the internal presentation of a body hemorrhaging into itself. She had felt this before. She knew exactly what it meant. He's bleeding internally, she said, over the noise of the room, loud enough to be heard without shouting. Aneurysm has ruptured. Continuing compressions is going to worsen the hemorrhage. He doesn't need cardiac resuscitation. He needs a vascular surgeon and an operating room. Callahan Stoll's voice had an edge in it, now that hadn't been there before. Not just anger. Something underneath the anger. Get vascular on the phone, she said, not to Stoll but to the room. And get bedside ultrasound in here right now. The imaging will confirm it in 90 seconds. You do not give orders. Then give them yourself. She looked at him directly, not confrontationally, not with heat, just with the complete absence of deference that sometimes lands harder than anger. Because if you run a cardiac protocol on a patient who is hemorrhaging from a ruptured aorta, he will be dead inside of 4 minutes. And you will spend the rest of your career knowing that a floor nurse told you the truth and you chose not to hear it. The room held its breath. The monitor continued its single flat tone. Stoll's jaw moved. Something shifted in his face, not capitulation, not admission, but the tiny internal collapse of absolute certainty. It did less than a second. Then he turned. Get vascular surgery on the phone, he said, to no one in particular, in a voice that was very carefully controlled. And bring ultrasound, bedside, immediately. Nora turned back to the patient. She did not perform. She did not demonstrate. She simply did what the moment required, moving with the precise economy of someone who had handled situations that were louder and bloodier and far less equipped than this clean hospital room. She called the pace. She managed the airway. She watched the senator's color, his breathing, and the numbers on the monitor with the kind of attention that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. When the ultrasound arrived 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, the image on the screen confirmed everything she had said it would. The vascular team was paged to OR 3. The senator was transferred with controlled urgency by a room that had finally reorganized itself around the correct problem. He was alive when the gurney left. Barely, but alive. The room emptied fast the way rooms do after a crisis moves to another location. People peeling off to their next task, the energy dissipating like pressure from a punctured line. Nora stood in the center of it after the last person left and looked at the space the senator had occupied. The tangled monitor leads draped across the mattress, the defibrillator pads still on the crash cart, unused vasopressor syringe sitting in its tray, the floor marked with the scuff lines of equipment moved too fast. Straightened the IV pole that had been knocked sideways. Collected the ultrasound probe from where it had been left on the mattress edge. Coiled the cord, set the machine against the wall where it could be retrieved properly. She began stripping the bed. Glenda came back to the doorway and stopped there. The older nurse looked at Nora for a long moment, not warmly, not coldly, with the complicated expression of someone who has just witnessed something they're not sure they're allowed to have witnessed. "You should document everything," Glenda said. Her voice was quiet, deliberate. "Tonight, before anything else happens." Nora looked up from the sheet she was pulling. Why would something else happen? Glenda held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then she turned and left without answering. Nora stripped the rest of the bed. She folded the used linens into the cart. She walked into the nurse's station, sat down at the terminal, and opened the documentation system. She began typing times, observations, exact words spoken, exact sequence of events, every clinical indicator she had identified, and the precise moment she had identified each one. She wrote it the way she had been trained to write assessments in environments where clarity of record was the difference between accountability and chaos. No opinions, no emotional language, just the sequence precise and complete. She was 4 paragraphs in when the floor doors opened. Dr. Stoll walked through them. He had removed the dinner jacket and rolled his shirt sleeves to the elbows, but the loosened tie was still there. Behind him came 2 people she didn't recognize, a man in a gray suit with no hospital identification visible, and a woman in a dark blazer with an administrative services lanyard that Nora was fairly certain she had never seen on this floor before. Not at this hour. Not ever, actually. Stoll's expression was not the expression of a man coming to acknowledge a difficult moment. It was the expression of a man who had already decided what this conversation was going to be. "Callahan," he said. "My office. Now, I'm in the middle of documenting the events of..." "Can wait." His eyes moved briefly to the screen, noting where she was in the record. Then back to her. Right now. She saved the document. She logged out. She stood, straightened scrubs, and followed them down the hall toward the office. At the end of the corridor, the man in the gray suit pulled the door shut behind them with the controlled precision of someone who wanted it shut firmly, but did not want to appear to be shutting it firmly. The folder the administrative woman set on the desk was already thick with papers. Prepared papers. The kind that take time to prepare. Nora sat in the chair across the desk and folded her hands in her lap and kept her face very still. Because she had been in rooms like this before. Not this room, not these people, not this hospital, but rooms with this exact temperature, this exact arrangement of authority, and paperwork and carefully preloaded accusation. She had learned in those rooms that the moment you let your face tell them what you're thinking, you've already lost a step. "We need to discuss the events of this evening," the woman from administration said, opening the folder with the brisk efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this. "Specifically, your unauthorized entry into a restricted patient room, your interference with treatment protocol directed by the chief of surgery, and the potential liability exposure that your actions have created for this institution." The suited man said nothing. He stood near the wall, with his arms at his sides, and watched Nora with the attentiveness of someone whose job it was to watch. Nora looked at the papers in the folder. She could see upside down that several of them had signature lines at the bottom. "Patient is in surgery," she said. "He is," the woman confirmed, because the initial diagnosis was incorrect. A brief pause. "That is a matter for a formal review process." The imaging confirmed a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, Nora said. which was the condition I identified and reported to Dr. Stolitz 1153P. The vasopressor that was ordered would have accelerated the hemorrhage. The patient survived because the correct intervention was applied in time. Stoll, who had been standing near the window with his arms crossed, said, "What you did constitutes unauthorized medical intervention. You exceeded your scope of practice on a restricted patient, regardless of the outcome. The outcome," Nora said, "is that he's alive. The outcome is that a floor nurse overrode the chief of surgery's treatment decisions in a restricted room in front of staff on a patient whose identity you were not authorized to know and whose case you were explicitly told to stay away from." He paused. "That is a terminable offense. It is potentially a criminal one." The woman slid one of the papers across the desk. Nora looked at it without touching it. It was an incident report, already filled in. Her name at the top. A description of events that was technically accurate in its sequence, but had been written with very specific choices about which facts to include and which to omit. The bottom, a signature line. And below that, in smaller font, a clause about acknowledging the terms of a voluntary separation agreement. "We want to handle this quietly," the woman said, "not unkindly, professionally. You sign this tonight, and this becomes an internal administrative matter. No licensing board involvement, no police report regarding the patient privacy breach. You clear out your locker before morning, and this is over." The gray-suited man spoke for the first time. His voice was flat and even. "Or we go the other route, which is messier for everyone." Nora looked at the paper. She thought about the 3 words in her notepad. She thought about Glenda's face in the doorway. She thought about the senator on the gurney and the way his color had looked, and the specific, certain knowledge that had settled in her chest the moment she had seen him, not a guess, not an instinct, but a recognition. Kind that comes from having seen enough of the real thing that your body knows it before your mind has finished processing the data. She looked up from the paper. "No," she said. The word sat in the room by itself for a moment. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "I won't sign it." Nora's voice was the same even tone it had been all night. No performance in it, no bravado, just a statement of a position she had already fully considered. "What I did tonight was correct. The patient is alive because of the intervention I initiated. I documented my observations and my communications in real time, and I will submit that documentation to the appropriate review bodies through the appropriate channels." Stoll straightened. "If you don't sign that, I know," she said. "You'll make it worse for me." She looked at him directly. "I understand that. I still won't sign it." The gray-suited man pushed off the wall. He took a phone from his jacket pocket and said quietly to someone on the other end of a call that Nora had not heard him place, "We're going to need the other option." Nora looked at the signature line on the paper one more time. Then she folded her hands back in her lap. Whatever was coming through that door next, she had made her decision. And she had made harder decisions than this, in darker rooms than this, with considerably more at stake than a nursing license and an administrator's folder full of carefully worded forms. She waited. Whatever was coming through that door next turned out to be 2 uniformed security officers from the hospital's overnight detail, broad-shouldered men who filled the doorway in a way that was clearly intended to communicate something without anyone having to say it out loud. Nora recognized one of them. His name was Gerald, and he had worked the overnight security rotation at Hargrove for at least 2 of the 3 years she'd been on staff. They had exchanged maybe 30 words total in that time, mostly variations of quiet night and stay safe. He didn't look at her now. He looked at the wall behind her head, which told her everything she needed to know about how this had been framed to him. "Miss Callahan," the woman from administration said, and the shift from Callahan to Ms. Callahan was deliberate, a quiet demotion, delivered through a single syllable. "If you're not willing to cooperate with the voluntary process, We'll need to proceed with a formal suspension pending investigation. That means surrendering your badge tonight, and it means you'll be escorted from the building. I understand, Nora said. And it means we'll be filing a report with the state nursing board regarding the unauthorized interventions this evening. I heard you. The woman looked at her with the more resistance of someone who had expected more resistance and wasn't sure what to do with the absence of it. Closed the folder. Then let's make this as brief as possible. Nora unclipped her badge from her scrub pocket and set it on the desk. She did it without ceremony. She picked up her notepad from where she'd placed it on the edge of the chair and put it in her pocket. She stood. Gerald and the other officer walked on either side of her down the corridor. They were careful not to touch her, which was its own kind of statement, close enough to communicate supervision, distant enough to avoid the legal definition of physical restraint. She walked at a normal pace. She didn't look at the nurse's station as they passed it, but she was aware of Glenda standing there, watching, of Patrick beside her, pretending not to watch, of the specific quality of silence that falls over a workplace when something is happening that everyone can see and no one is going to acknowledge out loud. The elevator came. They rode it to the ground floor. They walked her through the lobby empty at this hour, except for a single security desk attendant who found something urgent to examine on his computer screen as they passed, and out through the main doors, into the pre-dawn cold of a Salt Lake City November. The doors closed behind her. Nora stood on the concrete steps and breathed in the cold air and looked at the parking structure across the street where she'd been staring from the window of room 412 less than 2 hours ago. Her car was in the staff lot on the south side of the building. She had her keys. She had her phone. She had her notepad with 4.5 pages of precise time-stamped documentation and the clearest possible conscience she'd had in recent memory. She also had no job, a pending nursing board complaint, and the very real possibility that the gray-suited man's other option was more specific than a vague threat. She walked to her car. She sat in it without starting the engine and looked at the hospital building through the windshield for a long moment. Then she took out her phone and began to type. She sent 3 messages. The first was to a woman named Audrey Fisk, who had been Nora's nursing school roommate 14 years ago and was now a healthcare attorney in Phoenix. The message was brief and factual. I've been suspended and escorted out of Hargrove General following a patient intervention. I have documentation. Can you talk in the morning? No question mark. Not really a question. The second message was to a number she had not contacted in a long time, a number she kept in her phone under a name that was just initials, T. W, in case she ever needed it, and also in case she never did. Typed, something's happened. Not an emergency. Will explain. Call when you can. She held her thumb over the send button for a moment, then sent it. The third message she didn't send. She typed it, read it, and deleted it. It had been meant for someone who was no longer reachable, and writing it had been a reflex more than an intention. Put the phone in the cup holder and started the engine. She drove to her apartment. She did not drive fast. Professionally, Nora lived in a second-floor unit in a building that had been renovated sometime in the early 2000s and not significantly updated since. The hallway smelled of old carpet and the particular staleness of a building that didn't get enough cross-ventilation. Her apartment was a 1-bedroom with a kitchen she used for actual cooking, a couch she rarely sat on, and a desk in the corner of the bedroom where she kept her laptop and a battered cardboard box that she hadn't opened in 2 years. The box was taped shut and had no label. She kept meaning to throw it out. She never did. She sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and her notepad and spent the next hour reconstructing the full timeline of the evening from the moment she had clocked in to the moment Gerald had walked her to the elevator. She wrote it in pen, not because digital was unavailable, but because she'd learned that handwriting a timeline forced a slower, more precise engagement with the sequence. Couldn't cut and paste. You had to go in order. You had to commit to each detail before you moved to the next one. When she was done, she read it back twice. Then she opened her laptop and typed the same timeline into a document, added the specific clinical indicators she had observed and the differential reasoning she had applied, and saved the file in 3 separate locations, including a cloud backup. She took photographs of the handwritten pages with her phone and saved those too. It was 3:10 a.m. when she finished. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. She was tired, but the kind of tired that was too activated to sleep, the particular wired exhaustion of a body that had been running on alert for too long and hadn't yet received the signal that the emergency was over. Because it wasn't over. She knew that. The conversation in Stoll's office had been the opening of something, not the closing. She had turned down the document. That meant they would move to whatever they had decided the other option was. She didn't know exactly what that looked like. She had some guesses, and none of them were comfortable. She went to bed anyway. She set an alarm for 7 and lay in the dark with her eyes open for 22 minutes before she finally went under. The alarm pulled her out of a dreamless sleep, and she was fully awake by the time her hand found the phone to silence it. 4 hours and 11 minutes. Not enough, but functional. She'd operated on less. Audrey had replied at 6:48 a.m. Call me at 8. Save everything. Short, direct. Exactly how Audrey had always communicated. It was one of the things Nora had always appreciated about her. The other number, TW, had not replied. That was also normal. Replies from that number didn't always come fast. She showered, made coffee, and ate a piece of toast standing at the kitchen counter because she had learned a long time ago that eating was a discipline when stress removed appetite. She wasn't hungry. She ate anyway. At 7:40 a.m., she got a different notification. It was a news alert, triggered by a keyword she had set up years ago as a professional habit, the name of the hospital. The headline read, Hargrove General faces probe following VIP patient incident. Hospital spokesperson confirms internal review underway. The article was thin, 3 short paragraphs, clearly written fast and sourced from a single statement, but it confirmed that the senator's presence at Hargrove had leaked, and it confirmed that the hospital's first public move was to get ahead of whatever narrative might emerge by framing the situation as a controlled internal process. There was no mention of Nora, not yet. She read the article twice. She knew how this kind of framing worked. The internal review announcement was a buffer. It created the appearance of institutional accountability, while simultaneously giving the hospital a justification for withholding specific details under the cover of an ongoing investigation. It was a way of controlling the story's oxygen without appearing to smother it. She had seen similar maneuvers in different contexts. Different institutions, same mechanics. She called Audrey at exactly 8:00 a.m. Tell me everything, Audrey said, before Nora had finished saying hello. In order. Don't skip anything, because you think it's irrelevant, Nora told her. 23 minutes, uninterrupted, the same sequence she had documented the night before, delivered verbally with the same precision. Audrey made occasional sounds that indicated she was listening, but didn't speak until Nora was done. The folder, Audrey said, the papers they had ready. Pre-prepared, with your name on them. Yes, that took at least several hours to put together. Which means someone started preparing it before the senator even crashed. Nora hadn't framed it that way explicitly, but she had been circling the same conclusion. Yes, they anticipated needing to manage you, or they anticipated needing to manage something, and I was the most available variable. Either way, Audrey said, it means this wasn't just a reaction to your intervention. There was a reason they wanted the senator's admission contained. They didn't want anyone looking too closely at him, which means they didn't want anyone competent enough to notice something wrong. And you noticed something wrong. A pause. You still have the notepad? Yes. Don't let it out of your sight. Physical documentation is harder to claim was altered. Can you get me copies of everything before noon? I can do it now. Do it now, Audrey said. And Nora, don't talk to anyone from the hospital. Not Stoll, not the administrator, not HR, not even a nurse you trust. They call you, you tell them you're represented by counsel, and all communications go through me.
Understood.
Understood. One more thing. Another pause, longer this time. Patient, the senator. Do you know if he made it through surgery? I don't know, Nora said. I haven't been able to find out. Find out, Audrey said, and hung up. She found out 40 minutes later, not from a news source, but from Glenda. Text came in at 8:53 a.m. from a number Nora had in her phone from a shift coordination text chain scan that had been set up 3 months ago for a scheduling change. Glenda hadn't used it for anything personal before. The message was 4 words. He made it. Surgery, and then after a gap of about 36 seconds that Nora could almost feel across the screen, they're saying it was your fault. Nora read the second message 3 times. She typed back, "Who is saying that?" The reply took 2 minutes. Administrations sent a memo to floor staff this morning. It says an employee violated patient privacy protocols and interfered with treatment, and that the interference created additional risk. They didn't use your name, but everyone knows. Nora set the phone down on the table. She looked at the wall above the desk. There was a small mark above the desk. A scuff from when she'd moved the desk in the first week she'd lived here, the corner catching the paint. She'd always meant to touch it up. They're saying it was your fault. Senator was alive because she had been there, and they were telling the people who had watched it happen that she was the problem. Picked the phone back up and typed, "Thank you for telling me. Don't respond to this number again. They may be monitoring communications." She didn't know if that was true. She suspected it might be. She sent it anyway. The nursing board notification arrived by email at 10:17 a.m. It was official and formal and written in the specific language of regulatory process, which meant it was difficult to read quickly, but communicated clearly enough once you parsed it. A complaint had been filed against her license. The complaint alleged unauthorized scope of practice violations and potential patient endangerment. She was required to submit a written response within 14 days and to make herself available for a preliminary interview within 30 days. The regulatory timeline was designed to feel like a deliberate grind, not fast enough to resolve anything, long enough to create sustained pressure. She forwarded the email to Audrey without comment. Audrey replied in 6 minutes, expected. Don't respond directly. I'm filing a protective notice with the board today. They won't be able to contact you directly once it's filed. Nora put her phone face down on the desk and sat very still for a moment. This was the part they had calculated. This was the weight they were intending to apply the board complaint, the institutional memo, the framing that placed her actions as the liability, rather the misdiagnosis. They were going to make the cost of fighting high enough that the easier choice would seem obvious. Most people in her position would start reconsidering, would wonder whether they'd misread the situation, would begin to feel the specific gravitational pull of just making it stop. She understood the logic. She did not feel the pull. What she felt, sitting in her kitchen at 10:23 in the morning with her third cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop, was the same steady, low-temperature clarity she had felt standing in that office the night before. The same thing she had felt in other offices, in other circumstances, when other people with institutional authority had tried to make her believe that the correct thing to do was also so the impossible thing to do. She opened her laptop and began drafting her own formal account of the evening's events, not the regulatory response, which was Audrey's territory, but a detailed clinical narrative. She wrote it the way a medical report was written, with timestamps and anatomical specificity and the exact sequence of clinical reasoning that had led her from first observation to intervention. Cross-referenced it against the handwritten timeline. She was precise about what she had seen, what she had said, what had been said to her, and in what order. She was equally precise about what she had not done. She had not touched the patient without the supervising physician, eventually changing the treatment direction. She had not administered medication. She had called the intervention and directed the room, but the formal orders had come from Stoll. That distinction mattered. She knew it mattered. She was on page 4 when her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. Area code 202. She stared at it for a moment. Washington, D.C., she answered. Miss Callahan. A man's voice, middle-aged, measured cadence, the voice of someone used to having people listen when he spoke. My name is Thomas Wren. I'm calling on behalf of the Office of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I'd like to speak with you about the events at Hargrove General Hospital last night. The room was very quiet. How did you get this number? She asked. That's something I'd rather explain in person, he said. Are you able to meet today? She looked at the laptop screen. At the 4 pages of documentation still open in front of her. Cold coffee. At the mark on the wall she'd always meant to fix. Where? She said. They met at a coffee shop 12 blocks from her apartment, not the nearest one, not the one she usually went to, a specific location he had named that she'd had to look up. It was the kind of place that was large enough to have ambient noise, but not so loud that you couldn't hear someone across the table. She arrived 8 minutes early and sat facing the door. Thomas Wren arrived at exactly the agreed time, which told her something. He was 50, or close to it, with the kind of face that had probably been unremarkable even when it was young, and was now precisely calibrated to be forgettable medium height, gray suit lighter than the one the hospital man had worn, no visible ID. He carried a coffee he'd bought at the counter on the way in, which meant he'd scoped the room before she'd seen him enter. Look, he sat down across from her and did not extend his hand, which was a reasonable choice given the context. Thank you for coming, he said. You said you'd explain how you got my number. The senator's personal security detail keeps a log of all individuals with significant proximity to the protectee to Guta during a medical event. Your name was logged at approximately 11:58 last night. The rest was straightforward. He looked at her steadily. Senator Branford is stable. He's out of surgery. The surgical team confirmed the diagnosis: ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. The vascular team has indicated that the intervention delay was extremely close to fatal. She didn't say anything. The hospital has filed a complaint against your license, Wren said. You know this, yes. They've also been in contact with the local police department regarding a potential unauthorized disclosure of a protected patient's identity, specifically the claim that you accessed the senator's name during the incident. That was new. She filed it. The senator's office is aware of what happened last night, Wren said. The full version, not the hospital's version. We have the security details account, and we have access to the monitoring logs from the room, including audio. He paused. The room had audio capture. Standard protocol for protectee medical events. Hospital doesn't know that. The hospital does not know that, he confirmed. She looked at him for a moment. What does the senator's office want? Right now for the senator to recover, Wren said. After that, and this is preliminary, I want to be clear. The senator's legal team is considering their options. There are people at that hospital who made specific decisions last night that someone is going to want answered for. He picked up his coffee cup and put it down without drinking from it. We wanted to make contact with you before you made any decisions that might limit your options. What decisions would those be? Signing anything. Agreeing to anything. Accepting any kind of settlement that includes a non-disclosure component. She thought about the folder on the desk in Stoll's office. The pre-prepared papers with her name at the top and the signature line at the bottom. I didn't sign anything, she said. Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly. More like the quiet relief of a calculation being confirmed. I know. he said. That's why I'm sitting here. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a business card on the table. Plain, white, a name and 2 numbers printed on it. He pushed it toward her. When Hargrove's legal team contacts you, and they will, probably in the next 24 to 48 hours, they're going to come with a revised offer. It will be better than the first one. More money, cleaner language, possibly a reinstatement option designed to look like a concession. Don't sign it. I already have legal representation, she said. Good. He stood. Keep it. He looked at her for a moment before he turned to leave. You saved his life, Ms. Callahan. He knows that. Whatever happens next, he knows that. He walked out without looking back. Nora sat alone at the table. She picked up the business card and looked at it. She put it in her pocket with her notepad. She drank the rest of her coffee, which had also gone cold, because she had ordered it, and wasting seemed beside the point. Her phone buzzed. A text from Audrey. Hospital's attorney just called my office. They want a meeting. Tomorrow morning. I told them we'd confirm. And then, 30 seconds later, a second text. They're also claiming you took photographs of confidential documents on the hospital's computer system. Do you know anything about that? Nora stared at the message. She had not taken photographs of any documents. She had opened the senator's intake file, a file she had access to as a 4th-floor nurse, and she had run a browser search. She had not photographed anything on the system. She had not downloaded anything. She had not done what they were claiming she had done, which meant either they were fabricating it or someone else had accessed something last night and they were attaching it to her name. She typed back to Audrey, "No, that's not accurate. I need to talk to you tonight." The reply came back fast. "I'll call you at 7. Don't do anything until then." Nora put the phone in her pocket and walked out of the coffee shop into the gray November afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the traffic moving past on the street. An ordinary Tuesday. People driving places, walking places, carrying things, checking phones, doing the ordinary machinery of a day. She thought about the audio capture in the senator's room. She thought about the pre-prepared folder. She thought about what Wren had said. There are people at that hospital who made specific decisions last night that someone is going to want answered for. And then she thought about something else, something she had been carefully not thinking about since the moment she had walked out of Stoll's office the night before. A thread that had been pulling at the edge of everything else, quiet and persistent, the way a sound you can't identify keeps pulling your attention even when you're trying to focus on something else. Session. Senator Branford had come in through a private entrance with a private security detail at nearly midnight. He had been in significant distress on arrival. The hospital's senior physician had been pulled from a BIM social event, so not from home, which meant someone had reached him somewhere specific and he had come immediately. The folder with Nora's name on it had been prepared before she had been removed from the case. And the man in the gray suit, not Wren, the other one, from the hospital, had made a phone call during the meeting in Stoll's office to someone on the other end who was clearly already waiting for it. Someone had known this was going to happen. Not that Nora was going to push back. Not that the senator was going to crash. Something earlier than that. Something upstream of the emergency room and the gurney and the midnight drive. The senator had not simply been brought in sick. He had been brought in by people who knew he was sick and had made specific choices about how and where and under whose care he would receive treatment. And someone at this hospital, or connected to this hospital, had been part of making those choices. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold and let that thought sit where it had been trying to land since last night, and felt something in her chest tighten that wasn't fear and wasn't anger, but was the specific, quiet alertness of someone who has just recognized that the situation they are standing in is significantly larger than it appeared from the outside. Turned up her collar against the wind and started walking back to her apartment. She needed to make another call, not Audrey, not the T. W number that still hadn't replied. A different number. One she had memorized rather than stored. Because some numbers you didn't write down. She had hoped she would never need it. She was already fairly certain she was going to dial it tonight. She dialed the number from memory standing in her kitchen at 7:44 p.m., 13 minutes before Audrey was scheduled to call, because she had decided that the order of those two conversations mattered. It rang 4 times. Then a voice she hadn't heard in 2 years and 4 months said, "Callahan." Not a question, not surprised, just her name, delivered the way someone says a word they've been expecting to say eventually. "Reyes," she said. Brief silence. The kind that meant the other person was moving changing rooms, stepping away from something. She heard a door close on his end. "How bad?" he said. "I don't know yet. Bad enough that I'm calling you." Another silence, shorter. "Talk." She talked. She gave him the compressed version, not the full timeline she'd given Audrey, but the structural shape of it. The senator, the admission, Stoll's misdiagnosis, her intervention, Folder, the suspension, Wren, and then the part she hadn't told Audrey yet, the part she'd been turning over since she'd walked back from the coffee shop, the pre-prepared documents, the man in the gray suit who'd been waiting for a phone call, the specific choreography of an institution that had known it would need to contain something before the thing it needed to contain had fully happened. When she finished, Reyes was quiet for long enough that she checked her screen to confirm. The call was still connected. "You think the admission itself was the operation," he said. "Not a question either. I think someone chose that hospital for a specific reason. And I think the reason wasn't quality of care. You think Stoll was the reason. I think Stoll was part of it. I don't know how much of it." Okay. The word was flat and functional, the way he'd always used it, not agreement, just acknowledgement that he'd received the information and was processing it. "The number you called. You shouldn't have it anymore." "I know. I'm going to need 24 hours. I may not have 24 hours. The hospital's attorney wants a meeting tomorrow morning." "Don't go to that meeting," he said. "Audrey's already." "I know what your attorney will tell you. I'm telling you something different. Don't go to that meeting. Stall it. Give me until tomorrow night." Another pause. Callahan, the senator being alive. "That's the only reason this conversation is possible. You understand what I'm saying?" She understood. She didn't say so. She said, 24 hours, and ended the call. Audrey called at exactly 7. Nora told her to push the morning meeting. Audrey pushed back for 4 minutes, then agreed when Nora told her there was additional information developing that was material to their position. Audrey didn't ask what the information was. She was smart enough to know that if Nora was volunteering less than usual, there was a reason for it. 48 hours, Audrey said. "That's the most I can credibly buy without them getting a court to compel." 48 is enough, Nora said, and hoped it was true. She didn't sleep well. She woke at 5:20 a. With the specific alertness of a body that had decided rest was finished whether the mind agreed or not, and lay in the dark for 10 minutes running through the conversation with Reyes. The 24 hours. What it meant that he hadn't asked more questions, not because he didn't have them, but because he already had answers she didn't, which meant he already knew something about the situation that she'd only been guessing at. She got up, made coffee, sat to the desk with her laptop, and spent 2 hours doing the kind of research that anyone with a browser could do: public records, congressional committee assignments, lobbying disclosures, the particular web of institutional relationships that surrounded a 3-term senator on the Judiciary Committee. She was looking for intersections, points where financial interests crossed with the kind of people who might want a particular medical outcome for a particular patient in a particular hospital. She found more than she expected, and she stopped when she realized she was getting into territory that was above her ability to verify and potentially dangerous to sit on without context. She saved what she had, encrypted the file with a password she wouldn't write down, and closed the laptop. At 11:30 a.m., her phone rang. Not Reyes. Not Audrey. A local number she didn't recognize. She answered. Ms. Callahan. A woman's voice, professional and careful. My name is Sandra Okafor. I'm the lead investigative reporter for the Salt Lake Courier. I've been covering the Branford hospitalization. I'd like to speak with you. Nora's hand tightened slightly on the phone. How did you get this number? I have a source inside Hargrove General who confirmed you were the nurse involved in the senator's night. I'm not going to print your name without giving you the opportunity to speak first. A brief pause. I want to be fair to you, Ms. Callahan, but I'm going to run something tomorrow morning either way. The question is whether your perspective is in it. Nora looked at the wall above her desk. The paint scuff. Can't comment on anything involving a current patient, she said. I'm not asking about the senator's medical specifics. I'm asking about what happened to you after the incident. Intervention. A nursing board complaint filed within hours of your intervention. A hospital memo distributed to staff that characterized your actions as a liability. The reporter's voice was steady, not aggressive. The voice of someone who had learned that pressure was most effective when it was quiet. That's not a patient privacy matter. That's an employment and institutional conduct matter. She wasn't wrong. I'm not in a position to speak on the record right now, Nora said. That changes, I'll contact you directly. I'll leave my number, Okafor said, and gave it. Ms. Callahan, for what it's worth, what I'm hearing from inside that hospital is that you were the only person in that building last night who did the right thing. I think people should know that. The call ended. Nora added the number to her phone under the name S. Okafor, and then sat very still at her desk for a while, because the addition of a journalist to the situation changed its geometry in ways that could be useful and ways that could be catastrophic, depending entirely on timing. She left the number where it was and didn't call it back. Reyes called at 6:15 the following evening, earlier than she'd expected. I need you to meet someone, he said, without preamble. Tonight. Can you get to the federal building on West Temple by 8? Yes. Parking on the south side. Come in through the main entrance and ask for conference room 4C. Someone will be waiting. He paused. Bring your documentation. All of it. Physical and digital. Who am I meeting? People who have been watching Hargrove General for reasons that have nothing to do with you, he said, and who became very interested in you the moment you walked out of that building. The line went quiet. Then, Callahan, what you said about the gray suit, the man who made the phone call during the meeting. I need you to think carefully. Did he have an accent, regional? Anything? She thought about it. The voice had been flat. Deliberately, carefully flat, the kind of flat that sometimes meant the elimination of something natural. Midwest, maybe, or trained out of something else. Height, build, 6 feet give or take. Medium build. The suit was well fitted, not off the rack. And he made the call during the meeting. Not before, not after. During. Within the first 2 minutes. Another pause. Longer this time. Okay, Frey said, and she could hear in that single word something she hadn't heard from him, on the time she'd known him. Something that wasn't quite concern, but was adjacent to it. 8 o'clock. Don't be late. Conference room 4C was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of floor wax and recycled air, and the specific institutional gravity of a place where consequential things happened without public announcement. The hallway was empty when she stepped off the elevator. A woman in plain clothes met her at the door, early 30s, ID badge clipped to her belt rather than her jacket, the kind of handshake that was professional without being performative. Ms. Callahan, I'm Special Agent Dana Rourke, FBI Salt Lake Field Office. Thank you for coming. Inside the conference room were 3 other people. A man in his 40s in a dark jacket who introduced himself as Agent Michael Pruitt. A younger man who didn't introduce himself and sat to the side with a laptop open, taking notes. And at the head of the table, a woman Nora didn't recognize. but whose bearing had the specific quality of someone accustomed to being the most senior person in whatever room she was in late 50s, silver-streaked hair, pulled back, reading glasses on the table in front of her. "Sit down, Miss Callahan," the woman said. "My name is Director Carol Ashby. I'm going to be direct with you because I think you prefer that, and because we don't have the time to be anything else." Nora sat. She set her notepad and her phone on the table. She waited. "Hargrove General Hospital has been under federal investigation for 11 months, Ashby said. "The investigation involves a coordinated pattern of patient care manipulation, insurance fraud, and more recently evidence suggesting deliberate clinical interference in the treatment of specific individuals. Operative phrase is deliberate. We are not talking about negligence." The room was very quiet. "Senator Branford has been one of the investigation's subjects of interest, not as a suspect, but as a potential target. He sits on the Judiciary Committee and has been building a case file related to a specific network of financial actors with connections to 3 major hospital systems in this region, including Hargrove." Ashby picked up her glasses, turned them over, once in her fingers, set them down. "2 weeks ago, one of our informants inside Hargrove indicated that a plan was being developed to use a medical event as cover for an intervention. We were monitoring. We did not anticipate the timeline moving as fast as it did." Pruitt leaned forward slightly. "We were 40 minutes from having a team on site when the senator was admitted. The decision to bring him to Hargrove was made by someone inside his own security detail, someone who has since been identified as having a financial relationship with a principal in our investigation." Nora absorbed this without showing what it did to the arrangement of assumptions she'd been building for 2 days. The security detail member chose the hospital, specifically recommended it when the senator showed symptoms during a private dinner function, Rourke said. "There were 2 hospitals closer. Hargrove was selected. And Stoll was waiting," Nora said. "Stoll was contacted before the senator arrived," Ashby confirmed, "which is consistent with what you observed him arriving in a dinner jacket. He was pulled from a private event at a location we've been watching separately. The call to him came from a number linked to the same network." Nora thought about the gray suit, about the phone call made within the first 2 minutes of the meeting in Stoll's office, about the folder that had been prepared before she'd been removed from the case. "The man in the gray suit," she said, "during my suspension meeting. He made a phone call." Rourke and Pruitt exchanged a brief look. "We know who he is," Pruitt said. "His name isn't important right now. What's important is that the call he made during your meeting was to the same network. He was reporting that the senator had survived and that there was a witness who had refused to sign." A witness. The word landed with a weight she hadn't fully assigned to herself until this moment. "You've been building a case for 11 months, Nora said, "and you didn't have enough to move on them before last night." "Correct," Ashby said without apology. "And now?" Ashby looked at her steadily. "Now we have a failed clinical intervention that can be traced to a deliberate misdiagnosis by a physician with documented connections to the network. We have audio from the senator's room. The security detail captures audio that establishes the timeline of Stoll's decision-making and your attempt to correct it. We have financial records linking Stoll to 3 wire transfers in the past 14 months that we could not previously contextualize. And we have the testimony of a nurse who was present for the entire sequence and who documented it in real time. She understood what she was being told. She understood what she was being asked, even though no one in the room had asked it directly yet. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Your documentation," Rourke said, "and your formal testimony. And one other thing." She opened the folder in front of her and slid a single printed page across the table. "The hospital's attorney is going to contact you again tomorrow. They're going to make a revised offer. More money, a reinstatement offer, and a non-disclosure agreement. I was already told not to sign." "We need you to do more than not sign," Ashby said. "We need you to take the meeting. We need you to go in, listen to what they offer, and ask for 48 hours to consider it. That's all. Don't agree to anything. Don't refuse anything. Ask for 48 hours. You're using the meeting as a data point. We're using the meeting as an opportunity to establish who in that room has knowledge of the network's involvement and is actively working to suppress your testimony, Ashby said. The attendees, the specific language of the revised offer, the degree to which the terms reflect inside knowledge of our investigation, all of that is actionable intelligence. Nora looked at the printed page. It was a formal request for her cooperation, with an FBI case number at the top and signature lines at the bottom. Different from the folder on Stoll's desk. Different in every important way. Picked up a pen. I have conditions, she said. Ashby didn't blink. Tell me. My nursing license. The board complaint gets addressed, not buried. Addressed. I want a formal record of the circumstances that led to the filing. I'm not asking for immunity from legitimate review. I'm asking for the complaint to be contextualized accurately. Agreed, Ashby said, without checking with anyone else in the room, which told Nora this had already been discussed. My documentation remains under my control. Copies go to you, but I retain the originals and my attorney receives simultaneous copies of everything you receive. Agreed. And if the meeting tomorrow produces actionable evidence, if something happens, if something in that room that moves your timeline, I want to be informed before the public narrative is shaped. I was in that room. I was the reason the senator is alive. I will not be managed out of the story after the fact. A silence, not uncomfortable. The silence of someone doing a rapid calculation. That's a reasonable request, Ashby said. We'll do what we can. It wasn't a firm commitment. Nora knew it wasn't. She signed anyway, because the alternative was going into tomorrow's meeting without any structural support, which was worse. Pruitt collected her documentation. She handed over the physical notepad, watched him photograph each page with a forensic camera, and received it back, which had also clearly been agreed to in advance. She transferred the encrypted digital file to a secure USB drive Rourke provided. She answered 40 minutes of questions, precise and methodical, Pruitt moving through the timeline, while the unnamed man with the laptop recorded it, and Rourke occasionally asked for clarification. Ashby didn't ask questions. She listened. Nora noticed. When it was over, Rourke walked her back to the elevator and stood there while the doors opened. Ms. Callahan, Rourke said, the meeting tomorrow is at the hospital? What they've requested. Stoll's office. Something moved across Rourke's face. Request a neutral location. Don't go back to that building until we say it's clear. The elevator doors opened. Nora stepped in. Why, she said. Rourke held the door a half-second longer than necessary. Because two of the people who will be in that meeting have reasons beyond the civil case to want this contained. And the hospital is their environment, not yours. The door closed. Nora rode the elevator down alone and stood in the lobby for a moment before she pushed through the main doors into the cold, because she needed 3 seconds to adjust to what Rourke had just told her without saying it directly. Two of the people in that meeting have reasons beyond the civil case. Not institutional reasons, not liability reasons. The other kind. She walked to her car. She drove home. She sat at the kitchen table and called Audrey and gave her a version of the evening's events that covered the essentials without crossing lines she'd been asked not to cross. Audrey was quiet for a longer time than usual at the end of it. Change the meeting location, Audrey said. Already planning to. And Nora, if these people are what you're describing, if the FBI has been on this for 11 months, then tomorrow's meeting is not about your job. I know. You're going to be the most exposed person in that room. I know that too, Audrey exhaled. Okay, I'll be there. You won't be alone. She went to bed at midnight. She did not expect to sleep. She fell asleep faster than she had in 3 days, which sometimes happened when the worst-case scenario became concrete enough to plan around and the specific anxiety of not knowing what was coming gave way to the specific, exhausting clarity of knowing exactly how bad it could get. She was asleep by 12:15. Her phone began ringing at 2:43 a.m. The number on the screen was Rourke's. She answered on the second ring, already sitting up, already knowing from the hour alone that the 48 hours she'd been counting on had just collapsed. Change of situation? Rourke said, and her voice had a different quality than it had in the conference room, tighter, faster. We need you to get dressed and get out of your apartment. Right now. What happened? Stoll is dead, Rourke said. They found him an hour ago in his office, and whoever did it knows about the audio from the senator's room, which means they know we have it. And right now, I cannot tell you with certainty that they don't also know you were in this building tonight. Nora was already standing. Where do I go? She said. Stay on the line, Rourke said. I'm sending a car. 12 minutes, black SUV, government plates, driver's name is Castillo. Don't open the door for anyone else. Nora was already moving. Pulled on jeans, a sweater, her boots, functional choices, made without deliberation. The body running a checklist the mind had written a long time ago in different circumstances. Phone charger, laptop, notepad. She paused at the bedroom doorway and looked at the cardboard box in the corner, taped shut, no label, untouched for 2 years and 4 months, and then she picked it up and tucked it under her arm without fully examining why. Stoll, she said, phone wedged between shoulder and ear. How did they do it? Blunt force. Staged to look like a fall against the desk corner. It wasn't. Rourke's voice had changed from the conference room version tighter, the careful professional cadence, stripped back to something more direct. The medical examiner was on site within 40 minutes and flagged it immediately. Time of death puts the window at 10 to midnight. While I was in your building. Yes, so they knew about the meeting. We believe they knew about the audio capture. The meeting itself, possibly. We're working on the source. A brief pause. Callahan. People who made this decision tonight made it because Stoll became a liability to them. You are currently the most critical witness in a federal case that multiple individuals have already demonstrated they will kill to suppress. I need you to treat the next several hours with that in mind. Understood, she said. She checked the front window from the side old muscle memory, the kind that bypassed conscious decision before she moved to the door. The street below was quiet. A single car parked across the way that had been there when she'd come home. She noted its position and moved. Castillo was there in 11 minutes. She was outside in 10. The safe house was a residential property in Murray, 20 minutes south, the kind of house designed to look inhabited without being lived in. Lights on timers, a car in the driveway, curtains at angles that suggested occupancy. Pruitt met her at the door and took her bag. She let him. Kitchen table had been converted into a working surface. 2 laptops, a printer running, 3 accordion folders of documents, arranged by some organizational logic she didn't immediately parse, and a coffee pot that was recent enough to still be worth drinking. She poured a cup without being offered one and sat down. Tell me about Stoll, she said. Pruitt pulled out the chair across from her. He had the look of a man who had been awake since before her federal building meeting and had stopped calculating when sleep might happen. Jacket off, sleeves rolled, the particular flatness behind the eyes of someone running on task rather than energy. Found by cleaning staff at 1:15 a.m. His office, 4th floor. Staging was competent, but not professional. Whoever did it understood the concept of making a death look accidental, but didn't have experience executing it. The ME caught 3 inconsistencies within the first 20 minutes on site. He opened one of the folders. He'd been dead 2 to 3 hours at discovery. That puts it squarely in the window between 10 p.m. and midnight. Before Falk was picked up, Falk was detained at 2:10 a.m. Stoll died before that. We don't think Falk ordered it directly. We think the order came from above him, from someone who received information about the audio evidence and made a fast decision. Someone inside your communications chain. Pruitt didn't look away. That's the working assumption, yes. We've taken steps to compartmentalize the rest of this operation. The relevant question right now is how much they know about what you gave us tonight. She thought about it. The audio already existed before she'd walked into that building. The senator's security detail had captured it independent of anything she'd done. Her documentation added detail and human testimony to something that was already on record. The leak had communicated the existence of the audio, but not the contents of her cooperation agreement, not the full scope of what she'd handed over. Then whoever had ordered Stoll's death had acted on partial information. They know you have the audio, she said. They may not know how much of tonight's meeting they've actually lost. That's our read, Pruitt said, which gives us a window. Small one. He closed the folder. Ashby will be here at 6. There's a room down the hall. Try to get some sleep. She didn't sleep. She lay on the bed in her boots and opened the cardboard box. The uniform was folded, the way she'd folded it the day she'd packed it away, not ceremonially. Not with any particular intention, just neatly, because leaving it in disorder had seemed like a different kind of statement she hadn't wanted to make. The discharge papers, the commendation citation, her name printed under captain, signed by 2 officers she'd respected, and one she'd had complicated feelings about since the day she'd met him. A photograph of 6 people in front of a military transport vehicle in a landscape so featureless in its brownness that it could have been anywhere, which was part of what made it so specifically somewhere. Field medical manual with her own handwriting. In the margins, abbreviations and amendments, and one long note in the back pages that she'd written during a night when the alternative to writing had been worse. The unit patch, detached and folded separately. She held the citation for a moment. Read her own name. Put it back. She didn't feel nostalgic. She felt accurate, the specific, clarifying feeling of a map that matches the territory. She was who she was because of what was in this box, and what was in this box was what had been in that hospital room. And what had been in that hospital room was the reason a senator was alive, and a network's 11-month immunity from consequence was ending. Put everything back. She closed the box. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling until sometime before 6, when she fell into a short, dreamless unconsciousness that her body apparently decided to take without consulting her first. She arrived at 8 a.m. with Rourke, Pruitt, and a third agent introduced as Garrett Financial Crimes, lean and quiet. The kind of investigator who made himself easy to underestimate in rooms where he needed information from people who might not give it freely to someone they perceived as a threat. Nora was already at the table with her second coffee and her notepad when they came in. She sat, poured her own cup, and began without preamble. Warren Falk has been cooperating under a proffer agreement since 3:40 a.m. In the past 2.5 hours, he has given us a structural account of the network's operations that fundamentally changes the shape of this case. She set her cup down. I'm sharing the relevant elements with you directly because they involve you and because you've been operating in partial information for long enough. Nora nodded. Falk's official title was Director of Strategic Operations at Hargrove General. His actual function was patient access management, specifically routing high-value targets to network-affiliated facilities during moments of genuine medical vulnerability. The network operates across 3 hospital systems in this region. The methodology is consistent across cases. The target experiences a real medical event. Network contacts ensure the target is directed to a network facility. A network physician manages the treatment in a way that either delays effective intervention or subtly worsens the underlying condition. Outcome is documented as medical misadventure. No criminal charges. The network achieves its objective target dead, incapacitated, or frightened enough to change their behavior. Ashby's voice was flat and factual. Could have been describing a logistics process. Senator Branford was targeted because his Judiciary Committee investigation was approaching a point that would have exposed the network's financial infrastructure within the next 60 to 90 days. He was supposed to die at Hargrove, Nora said. Originally, no. That's the detail Falk provided that changes your understanding of what happened that night. Ashby paused, measuring. The original plan was incapacitation, not death. Senator Branford has a documented pre-existing aortic condition real, confirmed by his own cardiologist, monitored for 18 months. The network had access to his medical records through a breach in his personal health system we identified this morning. Stoll's directive was to use that underlying condition, accelerate it, manage it downward, create a trajectory of deterioration that would have appeared over weeks or months to be the natural progression of an existing illness. Senator Sux would have survived. He would have been physically diminished. He would have been unable to continue the investigation at the level of engagement it required. Kitchen was very quiet. Stoll pushed too hard, Nora said. Or the condition was more advanced than the stolen records indicated. We don't know if it was error or if Stoll made a unilateral decision to go further than he'd been directed. We may never know he's dead. Ashby looked at her steadily. What we know is that the rupture was not the planned outcome. The senator was not supposed to be in mortal danger that night. He was supposed to leave Hargrove General in worse shape than he arrived, quietly, with documentation. That would support a narrative of natural decline. Nora sat with that for a moment. The specific weight of it, not that someone had tried to kill the senator, but that someone had tried to break him slowly, and had accidentally gone too far. And that a floor nurse, who wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that room, had recognized what no one was meant to recognize and had pulled him back from an outcome his own handlers hadn't intended. People who planned this didn't want a death investigation, she said. A death meant scrutiny. Diminishment was cleaner. Considerably, Ashby said, which is also why your refusal to sign the suppression document created such a significant problem for them. In the original scenario, there would have been no dramatic emergency, no flatline, no room full of people watching a floor nurse override the chief surgeon. There would have been a patient who received treatment, showed some improvement, and was discharged in a stable but weakened condition. No obvious crisis, no obvious witness. Instead, they got me, Nora said. Rourke, who had been quiet until now, said, instead they got you. Garrett spoke for the first time, pulling a document from one of the folders. The financial component of the network is extensive. Wire transfers, equity positions in the 3 hospital systems, insurance product manipulation that generated returns when specific high-value patients experienced extended adverse outcomes. We've been building the paper trail for 11 months. Falk's account connects the financial architecture to the clinical architecture in ways our forensic accounting work had established circumstantially but couldn't confirm. He slid the document across to Nora. The network has been operating profitably for approximately 4 years. The Branford operation was not their first. We've identified 6 prior cases with similar methodology across the 3 facilities. 6. Nora looked at the document. Names she didn't recognize. Dates. Medical event classifications that she now read differently than she would have read them 2 days ago. All of them looked like natural causes, she said. All of them were documented as natural causes, Garrett said. The distinction was precise and deliberate. We have 3 cases where we now believe we can prove otherwise. The Branford case. Given the audio, Falk's testimony, and your documentation will be the strongest. Ashby leaned forward. There is one more element you need to know before the meeting this morning. The name at the top of Falk's account, the individual who controls the financial infrastructure and directs the target selection. She said the name. Nora sat completely still for 4 seconds. She knew the name. Not personally, she had never met him, but she knew it the way anyone who had spent 3 years working in a hospital building knew the name on the cardiac wing donation plaque at the end of the fourth-floor corridor. The name on the gala program she'd seen in the break room 3 weeks ago. The annual fundraiser she hadn't attended. The name that appeared on the hospital's website under a photograph of a silver-haired man in his early 70s accepting a community leadership award, flanked by smiling board members. He funded the cardiac wing, she said. There's a plaque outside the room where the senator almost died. His name is on it. We know, Ashby said. He was at the hospital board gala 22 days ago. There's a photograph in the fourth-floor corridor. We know that too. Ashby's voice carried the specific weight of something that had been 11 months in the building and had arrived. His name is Gerald Morrow. He's 71 years old. He controls a private equity portfolio with ownership stakes in 43 healthcare entities across 7 states. He has given approximately $14 million in philanthropic contributions to medical institutions in this region over the past decade. She paused. He has also, according to Falk's account, personally authorized every target selection the network has made in 4 years. Nora thought about the plaque, the photograph, the smiling board members, the cardiac wing that bore his name, built with money that had, according to everything Falk was saying, been generated in part by the deaths and diminishments of people the network had selected and processed like items in an inventory. He's been hiding in plain sight, she said. Philanthropy is excellent cover, Garrett said without irony. It creates institutional loyalty, public goodwill, and access. When you give a hospital $14 million, the hospital gives you relationships. Those relationships give you information. Information gives you access to exactly the kind of operational infrastructure the network required. We closed the folder. We are serving warrants on Morrow's properties and financial accounts this afternoon. We will be detaining him for questioning within the next several hours. His legal team is already mobilizing. He has resources that will make the arrest process complicated, the detention process contested, and the public narrative difficult to control in the short term. She looked at Nora directly. Which brings me to what we need from you this morning. The meeting with Hargrove's legal team happened at a downtown law office on the 11th floor in a glass-walled conference room that Audrey had selected for its visibility. Audrey met Nora in the lobby at 9:40 a.m., looking precisely like someone who had been relocated at 3 a.m. and had decided to weaponize her composure about it. 3 of them, Audrey said quietly, walking to the elevator. Patricia Muir Hospital's chief legal officer, experienced, hard to read. Outside firm partner, younger, mostly decorative, and a risk management consultant with no business card, who was introduced to my paralegal this morning using a name I have not been able to verify through any professional registry. What does he look like? Nora asked. Audrey described him. Not the gray suit Falk was in federal custody. Someone new. Someone moved into position overnight, which meant the network had redundancy built in, and the redundancy had been activated fast. I need 48 hours out of this room, Nora said. That's all. I know, Audrey said. Let me lead until they put something specific on the table. Patricia Muir was good. Nora recognized her quality immediately, the kind of legal professional who had spent decades making herself precisely as readable as she chose to be, which was almost never. The outside partner took notes and spoke when Muir indicated he should. The consultant sat at the far end of the table and watched. He watched Nora's hands specifically, not her face, her hands, and the notepad she had placed on the table without opening. Muir's revised offer was, as Wren had predicted 10 days of circumstances ago, substantially improved. Full reinstatement, back pay. A formal letter from the board acknowledging that Nora's clinical observations had contributed positively to the patient outcome, carefully worded to acknowledge the contribution without conceding the misdiagnosis. The nursing board complaint would be voluntarily retracted. The financial component was 3 times the initial figure, and the non-disclosure agreement covered any and all observations, communications, or information obtained during the course of employment at Hargrove General Hospital. Language broad enough to swallow not just the senator's admission, but everything Nora had seen, heard, or documented in 3 years of overnight shifts on the 4th floor. She read it twice. Her face did nothing. "This is thorough," Audrey said pleasantly. "We believe it addresses every legitimate concern," Muir said. "We'll need time to review." A fraction of a look between Muir and the outside partner. "We'd prefer a faster resolution, given the 48 hours," Audrey said, with the serene finality of a door being closed. As the meeting ended and chairs pushed back, that consultant around the table on a route that brought him within 3 feet of Nora. She noted the trajectory before he took it. Deliberate. He lowered his voice. "Miss Callahan, paper has a way of becoming a liability. Whatever you're holding on to, think carefully about whether it's worth it." She looked at him. "Is that legal advice?" He didn't answer. He walked out. Audrey was at her shoulder in 4 seconds. "What did he say?" Nora told her, word for word. Audrey's expression didn't change, but her eyes did. "He knows you have physical documentation, and he doesn't know how many copies." "No," Nora said. "He doesn't." She called Rourke from Audrey's car. Reported the consultant's comment verbatim. Described him in detail. Rourke listened without interrupting and then said, "We'll run it. Are you with your attorney?" "Yes. Stay with her. We're moving on Morrow's properties in 2 hours. Ashby is executing the warrants." A pause. "The senator has been moved out of the ICU. He's stable. He's asking to see you." Nora looked out the window at the city. "After," she said. "That's what I told Wren." She put the phone in her lap and watched Salt Lake City conduct its ordinary Wednesday traffic moving, people carrying things, the unremarkable machinery of a place that had no visible relationship to the dismantling happening inside its institutions. She thought about Gerald Morrow's name on a plaque, outside a room where a man had nearly died from an outcome even his killers hadn't intended. She thought about the 11 months of case building that had required a floor nurse on an overnight shift to produce the one element that made it, actionable. She thought about Stoll, who was dead because the network he'd served had decided his usefulness was exceeded by his risk, and how that calculation was the same one the network applied to everyone: physicians, senators, anyone who became a variable they couldn't control. The warrants went out at 4:17 p.m. Rourke texted 2 words, "It's moving." Nora was sitting at the safe house kitchen table with Audrey when the news began to break. Not through official channels, through the journalist. Sandra Okafor's byline appeared on the Salt Lake Courier's website at 4:52 p.m. attached to a story that was careful and specific and sourced with the kind of precision that suggested someone had been building it for longer than 2 days. The headline named Hargrove General. It named federal warrants. It named Gerald Morrow as a person of interest in a federal investigation involving the healthcare network. It did not name Nora. Okafor had kept her word. Audrey read the article on her phone and set it down. "She's good." "Yes," Nora said. "Your name will come out eventually." "I know. When it does, the story is going to be significantly larger than a nurse who saved a senator." Audrey looked at her with the direct assessment of someone who had known her for 14 years and was still occasionally surprised by her. "Are you ready for that?" Nora thought about the box. The uniform. The citation with her name and her rank and her record. The things she'd packed away because living quietly had seemed, at the time, like the right choice for reasons she'd understood then and still mostly understood now. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but it's not a choice anymore." 6:34 p.m., Pruitt called. His voice had a different quality, not excited, something more controlled than excitement. Quality of a case arriving at the destination it had been pointed toward for a long time. Morrow was detained at his residence at 5, 5:50 p.m. He came to the door himself. No resistance. A pause. His attorney arrived 11 minutes. The attorney's first question before anything else, before bail, before charges, was whether the nurse had signed the non-disclosure agreement. Nora was quiet. He knew about you from the beginning, Pruitt said. Falk confirmed it. After you refused to sign the first document, Morrow's network was tracking you directly. The revised offer this morning wasn't Hargrove's legal team acting independently. It was Morrow's instruction, communicated through Falk, before Falk was detained, passed to Muir through the consultant. The consultant works for Morrow, Nora said. He works for a firm that has done work for Morrow's equity portfolio for 6 years. We're pulling that thread now. Another pause. Callahan. Morrow's attorney's first question being about you, about whether you'd signed, that tells you what they were most afraid of. Not the audio, not Falk's testimony. You. She sat with that. The specific, strange weight of being the thing a network of people with $14 million in philanthropic cover and 4 years of operational immunity had been most afraid of. Reyes, she said. Does he know? He's been briefed, Pruitt said. He said, and I'm quoting, directly, she was always the variable they were never going to calculate correctly. She almost smiled. Not quite. What happens to the hospital? Federal receiver while the investigation completes. The board members who cooperated with the suppression effort are looking at option charges. Patricia Muir's firm has already issued a statement saying she acted without their knowledge, which is a legal positioning move. We'll see if it holds. He paused. The nursing board complaint against you was formally withdrawn at 5:15 p.m. by order of the board chair, who received a courtesy call from Director Ashby's office at 4:30. Withdrawn. The word landed cleanly. And the fourth floor? She said. The plaque. A brief silence. Building management has been notified. I imagine it comes down soon. After the call, she sat alone at the table for a while. Audrey had stepped into the other room to handle her own calls. There would be a great deal of legal machinery to engage in the coming days, the formal processes that followed the collapse of institutional wrongdoing rather than preceded it. Coffee pot had gone cold. The last of the day's light was leaving the window. She opened her notepad to the first page she'd written. That night in Stoll's office, the original timeline, pen and paper, the sequence she'd committed to before anyone had asked her to. Before she'd known there was an investigation or an audio capture or a federal case to be part of. She read it through from the top, the 11:20 p.m. clock in. The gurney in the hallway. The blood pressure reading Dennis had given her. 3 words she'd written and looked at and put back in her pocket. Flatline, the ultrasound image. The moment the room had reorganized itself around the correct problem. She'd written it because she'd learned, a long time ago, in a different kind of room, that the accurate record was the only thing that couldn't be argued with after the fact. Not because someone had told her to. Not because she'd known it would matter to a federal case. Because it was true, and true things deserved to be written down before someone with an institutional interest in the alternative version had the opportunity to write something else. Gerald Morrow's attorney had walked in a detention facility and asked before anything else whether she had signed. She hadn't. And now, sitting in a safe house kitchen in Murray with a cold coffee and a notepad full of handwriting that had helped bring down something that had been running for 4 years, she understood not with satisfaction, not yet, but with the particular clarity of someone who had done the right thing in the right order and was only now beginning to see the full shape of what that had cost and what it had produced, that the thing they'd been most afraid of was not her background, not her rank, not the specific clinical knowledge that had identified a ruptured aneurysm in a restricted room at midnight. It was the notepad, $3 from a pharmacy on State Street. Government surplus spiral bound, 3 inches by 5. And the discipline to write in it before anyone told her it mattered. Her phone screen lit up. A text from a number she didn't have saved, but recognized from the business card. Thomas Wren had left on a coffee shop table what felt like a different lifetime ago. It read, "Senator Branford would like to meet tomorrow, if you're willing. He has something he wants to say to you in person." No cameras, no staff, just him. She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the table and looked at the window, where the last daylight had finally gone, and thought about what came next, and what it would cost, and what it was worth. And in the morning, Director Ashby called with the detail that changed everything she thought she understood about how deep this had actually gone. She called at 7:12 a.m., and the detail she delivered in the first 30 seconds of the conversation reorganized everything Nora thought she had already understood about the shape of what she'd walked into 6 nights ago. Morrow's attorney filed a motion at 11 p.m. last night to have the audio evidence suppressed, Ashby said. Standard move, expected. What wasn't expected was the grounds. His legal team is arguing that the senator's security detail exceeded its authorization in capturing audio inside a medical facility, and that the recording therefore constitutes an illegal wiretap under state statute. A pause. The motion has a reasonable chance of partial success. Not full suppression. The federal wiretap argument is weaker than they're presenting it, but partial. Enough to complicate the evidentiary picture if the clinical testimony doesn't hold independently. Nora sat up straighter. My documentation, your documentation, your documentation, your testimony, and one additional element that Falk provided last night that we hadn't anticipated. Ashby's voice was measured. Falk kept records, not official records his own. An encrypted personal archive he maintained as insurance against exactly this kind of situation. The situation where the network decided he was more useful eliminated than operational. He has clinical logs from every patient intervention the network directed at Hargrove General over 4 years. Names, dates, specific treatment modifications, Stoll implemented, the financial transfers that followed each case. Another pause, longer. 7 cases, not 6. There's one we hadn't identified. Patient who died 14 months ago, documented as cardiac failure, whose treatment record now shows the same pattern of deliberate mismanagement. 7. Nora looked at the wall above the kitchen table. The ordinary, unremarkable wall of a house that wasn't anyone's home. Who was the 7th, she said. Ashby told her. A name she didn't recognize, a woman, 58 years old, a state-level prosecutor who had been building a fraud case against one of Morrow's subsidiary equity firms. She had been admitted to Hargrove General following what her family had described as a sudden cardiac event. She had died 11 days after admission. Her family had not questioned the cause of death because nothing about it had appeared questionable. Case had been closed. Her investigation had been absorbed by a colleague who had then, for reasons of workload, deprioritized it into effective dormancy. 14 months. The woman had been dead for 14 months, and until Warren Falk had opened his personal archive in a federal holding room in the middle of the night, nobody had known it was anything other than what it had been documented to be. She has a daughter, Ashby said, 26 years old. We're sending someone to speak with her this morning. Nora sat with that for a moment, not with the abstract weight of an added case count, but with the specific human weight of a 26-year-old who had spent 14 months grieving a death that was not what they'd been told it was. Who was going to spend this morning receiving information that would reopen every stage of that grief and reconstruct it around a truth that was in some ways worse than the loss itself? What do you need from me today? Nora asked. Your formal testimony is scheduled for this afternoon, 2 p.m. at the Federal Building. Audrey has already confirmed. Ashby paused. And the senator's request, Wren contacted us this morning. Branford wants to meet with you before the testimony. His medical team has cleared him for a short meeting. He's being transferred to a private recovery facility this morning. Wren will send you the address. Is that a good idea? Given the Morrow legal team's motion, it's not evidentiary, Ashby said. He's not a witness in the proceeding you're testifying in today. He's a man who wants to speak to the person who kept him alive. A beat. Go, Callahan. The testimony can wait 2 hours. Private Recovery Facility was a low-profile building in a residential neighborhood east of the city, the kind of place that announced nothing about itself, which was its entire point. Wren met her in the parking lot and walked her in, without much conversation, which she appreciated. The hallways were quiet. A nurse she didn't recognize as they passed, and Nora noticed the security presence, with Nora noticed the plainclothes agents positioned with the specific doing a casual of people doing a job they didn't want to be visible doing. The room was small and functional. Senator William Branford was sitting up in a chair rather than lying in the bed. Told her something is stubbornness. The bed was clearly where his medical team wanted him, and the chair was clearly where he'd decided he was going to be for this conversation. He was pale in the way of someone recently out of major surgery, with the particular careful stillness of a person whose body had communicated its limits in unmistakable terms and who was now negotiating with those limits rather than ignoring them. He looked older than his photographs. He also looked undeniably alive. He looked at her when she came through the door and didn't say anything for a moment. "Sit down," he said finally. His voice was rougher than she'd expected. The breathing tube left traces. She sat in the chair across from him. Wren closed the door and remained outside. "I watched the footage," Branford said. The audio from the room. "My detail gave it to Ashby, and she gave me access to the relevant portion." He looked at her steadily. "I heard what you said to Stoll. I heard what he said to you. I heard you get thrown out of that room and then come back." She didn't say anything. "You came back," he said, and there was something in the repetition of it that wasn't performance. It was the specific, unprocessed quality of someone who had almost died and was still working out the geography of that fact. Why? It was a genuine question. She thought about it genuinely. Because the answer was obvious and no one was acting on it, she said. "I can't watch something obvious go unaddressed. It's not a virtue. Closer to a compulsion." He almost smiled. It looked like it cost him something physically. "I've been told you were in the Army. Combat medicine." "Yes." "How long?" 8 years. He nodded slowly. "My chief of staff was in the Marines. He told me once that the people who do that kind of work, the ones who are genuinely good at it, they don't stop running the calculus. Even when they've left, they still see the field in every room they walk into." He looked at her. "Is that accurate?" "Close enough," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the building, a door closed. The ordinary sounds of a place running its quiet operations. "I'm going to ask you something," Branford said, "and I want you to tell me the truth, not the polite version." He waited for her nod. "Did you know who I was when you intervened? Did the name change what you did?" Considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I ran your name through a search after your intake file came up," she said. "So yes, I knew. But I'd already identified the clinical problem before I knew. I'd already been thrown out of the room before I knew." The name didn't change the presentation. She paused. "If it had been anyone else on that bed, anyone, I would have done the same thing." He looked at her for a long moment. "I believe that," he said. "That's actually the part that matters most to me." He shifted slightly in the chair and didn't entirely suppress the discomfort that produced. "My office is going to be issuing a public statement this afternoon. I want you to know what's in it before it goes out. You'll be named. Your actions will be described accurately, including the hospital's response to those actions. I've spoken with my legal team about the non-disclosure offer Hargrove extended, and I want to be direct with you that offer was constructed to protect Gerald Morrow, not the hospital. The board was operating under his direction." He paused. I want to make sure that's on the public record in my voice, not just in federal court documents. It's your decision to make, she said. I know. I'm not asking your permission. The almost smile again, slightly more fully formed this time. I'm telling you as a courtesy, because you've earned the courtesy of being told. She looked at him, this man who had nearly died in a way he wasn't even supposed to die, from a plan that had been designed to hurt him slowly rather than take him fast, derailed by a night shift nurse who had recognized what no one in the room wanted recognized. He looked and saw, and considerably more human than the official photograph on the government website. He had the look of someone who had been reminded, at significant physical cost, that being a senator didn't change your vulnerability to a body that could stop working on someone else's schedule. How are you actually doing? She asked. He blinked. It was apparently not the question he'd been expecting. Honestly, I feel like I was cut open and sewn shut again, which is accurate. He paused. And I keep thinking about the other people. The ones who were in those rooms before me and didn't have a Nora Callahan on the floor that night. She didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one. She stood. I have testimony to give in a few hours. I know. He looked up at her from the chair. Thank you, he said. Not with ceremony. Not with the performed gravity of a politician delivering a meaningful line. Just 2 words, plainly. The way people say things they actually mean when they've run out of the energy to wrap them in anything else. You're welcome, she said, and meant it. The formal testimony took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Nora sat across from 2 federal attorneys in a conference room on the 4th floor of the federal building and answered every question with the same precision she'd applied to writing the timeline in her kitchen 6 days ago. Audrey sat beside her and intervened exactly twice once, when a question's framing conflated her clinical observation with a medical diagnosis she wasn't licensed to make. Once when a follow-up question would have required her to characterize Stoll's intent rather than his actions. Both interventions were correct. Nora answered everything else directly. She was not a smooth witness. She said, I don't know 7 times, which was the accurate answer to 7 questions, and which the federal attorneys, to their credit, noted without apparent frustration. She corrected herself twice when she realized mid-answer that she was conflating 2 separate moments in the timeline, stopped, and restarted from the accurate point. She asked for water once and waited while someone got it before continuing, because continuing without it would have required rushing, and rushing would have meant less precision, and precision was the point. When it was over, the lead attorney, a woman named Sorensen, who had said almost nothing beyond her questions, and whose expressions communicated nothing beyond professional attention, looked up from her notes and said, Your documentation is exceptional. I want to say that for the record. It's what I was trained to do, Nora said. Your nursing training? No, she said. Earlier than that. Sorensen nodded, made a note, and closed the folder. The public unraveling of Gerald Morrow's network was not a single moment. It was a sequence, spread across days, each piece arriving and being absorbed and generating the next. Nora followed it from the safe house, then from her own apartment when Rourke confirmed it was clear to return. Then from the world in general, as the story became large enough to require no particular proximity to observe. Morrow was formally charged on day 3. The charges were extensive conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and 3 counts of second-degree murder relating to the 3 patient cases Falk's records had confirmed as deliberate. The 7th case, the prosecutor's death 14 months ago, was being investigated as a 4th count pending completion of the forensic review. His attorneys immediately filed for bail. The bail was set at a number that communicated something about what the federal judge thought of the flight risk. Morrow posted it. He was released to house arrest, which meant he went from a building he owned to a residence he owned, anklet and all, while his legal team spent what Garrett privately described to Nora as an almost incomprehensible amount of money on the defense architecture. The plaque came down from the fourth-floor corridor of Hargrove General on day 4. Building management did it early on a Thursday morning before staff arrived. Someone took a photograph of the empty wall, where it had been the clean rectangular outline left by years of the plaque hanging there. The paint slightly less faded in that shape, the ghost of a name, and posted it without comment on the hospital's internal staff message board. Stayed up for 6 hours before it was taken down by an administrator. By then, it had been screenshotted broadly enough that the taking down didn't accomplish anything. Nora didn't see it until Glenda sent it to her, a text with no message attached, just the image. She looked at it for a moment, the pale rectangle on the wall. The exact shape of something that had been there for years and was now absent. She saved the image to a folder on her phone and didn't label the folder. The nursing board formally closed the complaint against her on day 6. Closure letter was 3 paragraphs and used the specific regulatory language of a process that had concluded in the complainant's favor, which meant it was careful and official and communicated the outcome without exactly acknowledging what the filing of the complaint had actually been. Audrey read it and said it was as good as the board was capable of producing, given that they were also managing the secondary embarrassment of having accepted a complaint that had been filed in bad faith by an institution, whose chief legal officer was now under investigation. Frame it or don't, Audrey said. Either way, it's done. I'm not framing it, Nora said. I know. I'd have been surprised if you said yes. Sandra Okafor's full investigation piece ran on day 8, not just the Courier, but syndicated to 7 other outlets, 3 of which were national. It was long, carefully sourced, and built around a central narrative that Okafor had assembled from public records, court filings, and interviews with people who were willing to speak on record now that the federal case had given them structural protection. Nora was in it, named and accurately described. Her military background was in it. The timeline of the night was in it. The prepared suppression document was in it, described through the account of a source Nora suspected was Glenda, though Okafor's sourcing was careful enough that she couldn't be certain. The piece's final section was about the 7th patient. The prosecutor who had died 14 months ago. Her name was Karen Aldis. Her daughter was 24, not 26. Ashby had been given an approximation in the early briefing. Her name was Jess. Okafor had interviewed her, and the interview was the part of the piece that Nora read twice and then set her phone down and didn't pick it back up for 20 minutes. Jess Aldis had said, I spent 14 months believing my mother's heart had given out. I spent 14 months being careful not to be angry at her for dying because you can't be angry at someone for their heart giving out. You can only miss them. And now I find out there's something to be angry at, and I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if it's better or worse to have someone to blame. Nora thought about that for a long time. She thought about the specific mercy and cruelty of the truth, how it could give you back something and take something else away in the same motion. How Jess Aldis had lost her mother twice in 14 months. Once to what she'd thought was a random biological failure, and once to the knowledge that it hadn't been random at all. How the second loss was in some ways the harder one, because it came with the understanding that it could have been prevented, that there had been a moment, a room, a physician, a decision where the outcome could have gone differently. And she thought about what it meant that she had been in a room just like that one. That she had recognized the moment, that she had not looked away from it, even when looking away would have been considerably easier and would have cost her nothing. Hargrove General's board of directors was dissolved by federal order on day 11 and replaced by an interim administrative body appointed by the state health authority. Patricia Muir's law firm severed her employment and issued a statement. The outside firm partner cooperated with investigators and received a cooperation credit. Dennis Farrow, the charge nurse who had told Nora to stay away from the East Corridor, was interviewed twice, cleared of knowing participation, and returned to work under the interim administration. He sent Nora a text on day 12 that said only, "I should have listened to you." "I'm sorry," she replied. "You didn't know. Neither did I, fully." Care of the floor. He sent back a single word, "always." Warren Falk pleaded guilty on day 14 to conspiracy and obstruction charges in exchange for the complete cooperation he had already been providing and a sentencing recommendation that Nora was told about but had no role in. She had no feelings about the recommendation itself. It was a legal calculation between prosecutors and a man who had spent years facilitating the deliberate medical harm of human beings. And whatever number of years the calculation produced was going to be insufficient in some way that numbers always were when applied to that kind of damage. She thought about Karen Aldis, and then she stopped thinking about Warren Falk's sentence. The Morrow case moved through the pretrial phases with the speed of a federal prosecution that had 11 months of preparation behind it and Falk's records in front of it. Attorneys were excellent and expensive, and filed motions with the consistency of people doing the job they were paid to do. Some of the motions had partial success. The audio suppression argument succeeded in limiting one portion of the recording, but not the clinical section, the part where Stoll's own voice, deliberate and clear, could be heard directing treatment he knew was wrong. That section survived every challenge. Nora's documentation survived every challenge. Falk's records survived every challenge. On day 22, Nora received a letter on official stationery from the state's Nursing Regulatory Board. That was not the closure letter that had already come. This was different. It was an invitation to participate in an advisory panel reviewing scope of practice protocols for emergency clinical situations involving nursing staff, convened in response to recent events that have identified gaps in current guidance. The panel's chair was a woman Nora had never heard of. The invitation was formal and careful and asked for a response within 30 days. She read it twice. She set it on the desk next to her notepad. Then she called Reyes. He picked up on the second ring, which was unusual. "I heard," he said before she spoke. "The panel invitation?" "The whole thing. I've been following it." A pause. Not uncomfortable. The pause of someone organizing what they want to say. "How are you?" She thought about how she actually was, which was a more complicated question than it might have appeared. She was tired in a way that had accumulated across 22 days of sustained alertness and was only now, with the immediate pressure reduced, beginning to make itself fully known. She was fine in the specific sense of being uninjured and functional. She was not fine in the sense of having processed any of what the past 3 weeks had deposited in her: the death of Stoll, the face of Senator Branford in a chair fighting the discomfort of his own recovery, photograph of a pale rectangle on a corridor wall, the interview with Jess Aldis that she had read twice and then set her phone down for 20 minutes. "I'm working on it," she said. "That's honest," Reyes said. "Panel. I'm going to say yes. I thought you would." Another pause. Callahan. "What you did in that room, the clinical piece, the documentation, the refusal to sign. I want to say something about it, and I need you to hear it without deflecting. All right. You saved his life, and then you stayed when leaving would have been easier, and then you told the truth when the truth was expensive." That's the sequence. A lot of people, good people, capable people, break somewhere in that sequence. Usually at the second step, sometimes the third. He paused. "You didn't break." She didn't have a response to that. She wasn't sure one was required. "I know," she said finally, which wasn't agreement with a compliment. It was something more precise than that. An acknowledgement of the sequence. An honest reckoning with the fact that she had done what she had done, and it had cost what it had cost, and she would do it again in the same circumstances, without modification, which was the only metric that she trusted for evaluating whether a decision had been correct. "Take the panel," Reyes said, "and sleep in that order." She almost laughed. Goodbye, Reyes. Take care of yourself, he said, which was the closest he had ever come, in all the time she'd known him, to saying something unguarded. She went back to Hargrove General on day 29. Not to her old floor, not to reclaim anything. She went because the interim administration had requested a meeting, and because Audrey had reviewed the request and determined it was legitimate and worth attending, and because Nora had decided that avoiding the building served no purpose beyond the avoidance itself, which was not a sufficient reason. The building looked the same from the outside. Buildings always did. The parking structure across the street was the same structure she'd stared at from the window of room 412. The main entrance had the same automatic doors, the same security desk, the same institutional smell of disinfectant and recycled air that she'd walked through 1,000 times on 1,000 overnight shifts without thinking about it. The interim administrator was a woman named Dr. Sylvia Park, appointed by the state authority who had no connection to the previous board or any of the individuals under investigation. She was in her early 50s, direct without being brusque, and had the particular quality of someone who had been brought into a damaged institution and was genuinely trying to assess the damage before deciding what to do with it. "We want to offer you reinstatement," Park said, directly, without the layered framing Muir had used. "Full reinstatement, your previous position, your previous compensation, plus an adjustment. I'll let HR explain if you want to hear it. No conditions attached to the offer, no documentation requirements, beyond the standard return-to-work forms." Nora had known the offer was coming. She had spent several days thinking about her answer. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I'm not going to accept the position." Park looked at her steadily. "Can I ask why?" "Because the 4th floor is not where I need to be anymore." She paused, assembling the answer honestly rather than diplomatically. "I spent 3 years on overnight rotation, being invisible. I was good at the work. I don't regret the work. But I went into that building to be quiet, and that's not what the situation called for, and I'm not interested in going back to quiet." She looked at Park. "The panel invitation from the nursing board. The scope of practice review. I heard about it," Park said. "I'm going to accept that. And I've been contacted by 2 nursing advocacy organizations about speaking about clinical intervention protocols. I'm considering both of those." She paused. "I think I'm more useful in those spaces than I am back on this floor. And I think you need to rebuild this floor with people who don't carry what I'm carrying into it right now. They deserve a fresh start. So do I." Park was quiet for a moment. "That's a reasonable answer," she said, "and probably the right one." She looked at Nora with the directness that seemed to be her baseline mode of operation. "What you did here, what happened in that room, we're going to make sure it's in the institutional record, accurately. Not the version the previous board was building, the accurate version. I want you to know that. I appreciate that," Nora said. She left the building through the main entrance. She stood on the concrete steps, for a moment the same steps she'd stood on the night she'd been walked out by Gerald and the other security officer, the cold pre-dawn air of a Salt Lake City November, the parking structure across the street. 29 days. The city was the same. She was not entirely the same, which was neither complaint nor celebration, just the accurate description of someone who had been through something and was now standing on the other side of it, still upright, still clear, still herself. She walked to her car. She sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, the way she had the night she'd been escorted out, but differently. Night she'd sat in the stillness of someone who had just had everything stripped away and was taking inventory of what remained. This morning she sat in the stillness of someone who knew exactly what she was carrying and where she was taking it. She had her notepad. She had her documentation. She had the testimony she'd given and the record it had entered. She had the panel invitation on her desk and the advocacy contacts in her phone and the conversation with Reyes, still settling into whatever it was going to become over time. She had the memory of the senator's face in a recovery room chair, the plainly delivered 2 words, and the specific satisfaction of having earned them through something real rather than having them handed to her through something easy. She had the knowledge of Karen Aldis and of Jess Aldis and of the 5 other people in Falk's records, whose stories were still being told in courtrooms and family conversations, and the particular private grief of people who were finding out that the world had been less safe than they'd believed. That knowledge was not comfortable. She didn't want it to be. Comfort with that knowledge would have meant something had gone wrong in the part of her that knew the difference between what was tolerable and what wasn't. She started the engine. What she had learned not in the past 29 days, but over the full course of a life that had moved from military transport vehicles in featureless landscapes in a hospital to overnight shifts, building to a federal conference room to a safe, house kitchen to a chair across from a senator who had almost died from a plan that had specifically excluded her as a variable, was this: the people who design systems of harm rely on one assumption above everything else. They assume that the people closest to the damage are also the people with the least power to name it. They build their operations around that assumption. They staff their rooms with people they expect to be invisible, manageable, containable. They calculate the variables and they leave out the ones that don't register on the metrics they're using. They left out Nora Callahan. Not because she was as exceptional in the way of legends or heroes. She was not a legend. She was a person with a specific set of skills and a specific set of flaws and a specific reflect fest toward honesty that had cost her things before this and would cost her things again. She lost her temper occasionally and kept it better than most. She had nights when the box in the corner of her bedroom felt heavier than she wanted it to. She had made decisions in her life that she would not make again, and others she would make exactly the same way, with exactly the same information. She was not smooth, and she was not perfect, and the version of herself that had stood in that hospital room at midnight was not performing competence. She was running on genuine knowledge and genuine stubbornness and the genuine inability to watch. Something obvious go unaddressed, even when addressing it came with a personal cost she hadn't finished calculating. They had looked at her and seen a floor nurse, overnight rotation, invisible. They had looked at the wrong thing. She pulled out of the parking lot and onto the street, and the city moved around her the way it always did. Ordinary and continuous, full of people who were not aware of what had just been dismantled inside their institutions, and people who had been harmed by it, and people who were going to have to find their way through the knowledge of that harm for years to come. The city was all of those things at once, the way cities always were. She had somewhere to be. The panel met in 3 weeks. She had a statement to prepare and 2 advocacy calls to return, and a conversation with Audrey about the formal documentation of her exit from Hargrove that needed to happen before the week was out. She had Reyes's voice on the phone saying, "Take care of yourself," with the unguarded quality of someone who meant it. She had her own name, accurately, on a public record that could not be revised by anyone with a folder full of pre-prepared documents, and a signature line at the bottom. She had what she'd always had, the clear-eyed knowledge of what she'd seen, what she'd done, and why. It had always been enough. It turned out it was more than that. It turned out it was exactly the thing they hadn't been able to calculate, contain, or take from her, not with institutional authority, not with a nursing board complaint, not with a gray-suited man in a conference room saying, "Paper has a way of becoming a liability," not with an offer that was 3 times the first one and still required her silence as the price. She had refused to be silent. And the people who had built their entire operation on the assumption that a quiet woman in blue scrubs on an overnight shift would stay quiet, those people were now the ones facing the consequences of having been wrong. She merged onto the highway and pointed herself toward everything that came next and did not look back.